The transformation of a man in marriage never happens in one dramatic moment. It arrives quietly, like steady rain day after day, until he doesn't even notice he is getting soaked. At first, it's all small things. He skips a night out with friends because family feels more important. He chooses the meal someone else likes instead of what he truly wants, because it seems not worth the argument. He stays silent when his opinion is brushed aside, just to keep the peace. Each choice seems harmless, even reasonable. Yet those very choices begin to set him on a new path. A strong man does not lose his spirit overnight. He loses it piece by piece, through hundreds of nods, hundreds of silences. Like a stone statue that does not shatter from a hammer's blow but is worn down by wind and dust over the years. By the time he realizes it, the original form has already faded. The most dangerous part is how familiar it feels. The first time you give in, you feel discomfort. But repeat it enough, and the discomfort disappears, replaced by a sense of safety. You convince yourself you are maturing, that you are keeping harmony. In reality, you are only growing used to the loss of your own voice. As time passes, what once excited you begins to vanish. The hobbies that once made you feel alive become distant memories. You look back on your younger self and dismiss him as reckless, immature. But perhaps those reckless moments were the most vital parts of you. And when that part dies, what remains is only a busy shell, useful, efficient, but hollow inside. A man does not lose himself because he is weak. He loses himself because he fails to notice the small things. He doesn't realize that silence upon silence slowly replaces the inner voice. He doesn't see that the countless little concessions have piled up into a wall that now stands between him and who he truly is. If you want to know where disappearance begins, look to the moments of silence. When you have an opinion but swallow it. When you have a desire but push it aside. When you feel dissatisfaction but choose to stay quiet. These are not just silences of speech. They are silences of the self. One day, you may look in the mirror and see a face that is familiar yet strangely distant. It is still you, but the light in your eyes is gone. Still you, but the fire of ambition has burned out. That is when you realize what you have lost. And it did not come from one tragic event, but from thousands of small silences that together created one enormous disappearance. The illusion of equality in marriage. One of the most enticing promises marriage offers a man is equality. Two individuals walking side by side, sharing burdens, enjoying rewards together. The idea sounds both romantic and fair, striking the deepest human desire to have companionship without being left behind. But if you look closely, you will see that this equality exists more in words than in reality, where the balance almost always tilts to one side. At the beginning, marriage is wrapped in beautiful commitments. We will decide everything together. We will share both struggles and joys. These words make a man believe he is entering true partnership. Yet slowly, he realizes the balance is shifting. Authority in the household is not shared equally but slides silently to one side. What is striking is that this shift does not happen through overt force. It takes place through a series of reasonable arguments that are difficult to oppose. In matters of money, he is told there must be a joint plan for clarity. In matters of social life, he is told the family should schedule time properly so no one is left out. In matters of the future, he is told they must prioritize the children, the home. Each point is logical on its own, but together, they form a framework where he is no longer deciding but merely carrying out. He thinks he is contributing his voice, But in truth, he is only confirming choices already set. What makes this shift so difficult to detect is the illusion of love. The man does not feel forced. On the contrary, he feels willing. He believes compromise is a sign of maturity. He convinces himself that sacrifice is proof of love. Yet in that very willingness, he hands away his power of choice. Freedom is not stolen by violence. It is given up voluntarily, disguised as devotion. What is often called partnership is sometimes nothing more than submission dressed in new clothes. One side believes they are walking together, but in reality they are simply following. One side thinks they have a voice, but in reality they are only echoing the other. And the harsh truth is that the longer this continues, the more convinced the man becomes that this is unity, when in fact, he has lost his equal footing. The signs are subtle but clear. When your opinion is only accepted if it matches the other person's, that is not equality. When your personal choices are consistently dismissed under the banner of "we must agree," that is not companionship. When you constantly feel the need to prove cooperation by staying silent or giving in, what you have is not equal love but carefully disguised control. The difference between companionship and management lies here. In a true partnership, both people have the right to preserve their individuality, to disagree without being branded as disloyal. In a disguised system of control, every disagreement is labeled a mistake, every independent thought seen as a threat. A man who cannot see this distinction eventually convinces himself he is working together, while in reality, he is living in a sweet form of submission. It is necessary to pause and be honest with yourself. Are you walking beside your partner, or are you walking behind? Do you truly have a voice in major decisions, or are you only there to sign off? Are you living in genuine equality, or only inside a carefully crafted illusion of it? If equality truly exists, you will feel space for yourself. You will be able to say no without being judged. You will be able to choose differently without being called selfish. You will be able to hold on to your individuality without being accused of betraying the relationship. But if those things no longer exist, chances are you are being led more than you are walking together. A man who remains clear-headed understands that holding on to his individuality in marriage does not mean selfishness. It is the foundation for love to last. Because love can only endure when both people are allowed to remain fully themselves, not when one becomes nothing more than the shadow of the other. The financial shackles and dependency. For many, merging finances after marriage feels natural. It is seen as proof of trust, the foundation for building a strong family. A man enters marriage believing he is doing the right thing when he pours his labor, income, and time into what is called ours. Yet behind this logic lies an uncomfortable reality joint. Finances often turn a man's work into the engine that powers a dream he does not fully own. Consider how this unfolds. A man works harder, takes on longer hours, and shoulders greater financial responsibility. But the house he is paying off is not one he truly chose. The furniture and belongings do not reflect his tastes. The spending plan is rarely his to direct. He works more, sacrifices more. Yet his right to decide how to use the fruits of his labor steadily slips away. Effort and decision become separated, and that is when his freedom begins to erode. What makes this dynamic even more dangerous is the way it comes wrapped in reason. We need to think of the children's future. We must save to stay secure. We cannot afford to be selfish. Each statement sounds valid, but repeated often enough, they form invisible chains. The more a man tries to prove his responsibility, the more tightly he is bound to a system where choice no longer belongs to him. Once a person sees that his effort no longer connects to the results he desires, he slips into what psychologists call learned helplessness. It is the sense that no matter how much you try, nothing changes. The man no longer asks, "What do I want?" He only asks, "What do they need from me?" He stops seeing himself as an individual with his own dreams and becomes a resource to sustain the collective. And as that helplessness settles in, identity fades with it. Many people mistake freedom as something measured by the ability to travel or speak. In truth, the clearest measure of freedom lies in your relationship with money. Money is crystallized time, sweat, and energy. If you cannot decide where it goes, then you no longer decide where your life goes. A man may live in a beautiful house, drive an expensive car, wear fine clothes, but if none of it reflects his choices, then he is simply laboring for a dream that belongs to someone else. Some men comfort themselves by saying, "As long as my family is happy." But how stable is happiness when it is built on one-sided sacrifice? How long can it last when one person must constantly bury his own dreams to sustain someone else's vision? At that point, marriage stops being companionship. It becomes a system of redistribution, where the man serves as the engine and someone else takes the wheel. This reality forces a difficult question. Do you still own the labor you give? Or have you become the provider of fuel for a machine in which you are only a silent operator? If the answer makes you hesitate, dependency may already have taken root in your life. Personal freedom cannot exist without financial independence. A man can compromise in many areas, he can adjust many habits. But the right to direct the fruits of his labor must never be surrendered. For once that right is gone, he is no longer the author of his story. He becomes a worker in his own life, producing value each day to sustain a script written by someone else. And that is the point where, though still breathing, still working, still living, the deepest part of life, the sense of freedom and ownership, no longer belongs to him. Isolation from the social network. One of the quiet yet most powerful changes in a man's life after marriage is the gradual shrinking of his social world. At first, he still keeps a few familiar routines, weekend gatherings with close friends, a trip outdoors with the group, or the occasional spontaneous meetup after work. These connections are not just for leisure. They are spaces where he is reflected back to himself, reminded that beyond the roles of husband, father, or provider, he is still an individual with his own joys and desires. But over time, those rhythms are replaced by family obligations. Weekends once reserved for friends become days for cleaning, repairs, and errands. Group gatherings are pushed aside because family must come first. The spontaneity of grabbing a coffee, playing sports, and/or having a carefree talk fades away under the weight of a shared schedule. Slowly, the man realizes his world has grown smaller, while his life is confined to a cycle of duties. On the surface, this all seems reasonable. Who wouldn't want to devote more time to family? Who wouldn't make small sacrifices to protect the home? Yet that very logic hides a dangerous truth when outside connections disappear. Personal identity dissolves with them. Human beings do not exist in a vacuum. We see ourselves through reflection in others. Friends, colleagues, communities, these are mirrors that remind us of who we are. When those mirrors break, our true image fades as well. This isolation usually begins gently, through words that sound caring. Why don't you spend weekends with family instead of friends? Or, your friends are still childish, but we have responsibilities now. The man hears these things and believes he is choosing love. But the real cost is that he is destroying the very mirrors that reflect his identity, making it harder and harder to recognize himself. Once isolation takes hold, the psychological consequences emerge. Without friends to confide in, he loses a reference point to judge whether his situation is normal. Without those who remember his younger self, he forgets what he once loved and dared to pursue. Without a community to reflect his individuality, he becomes shaped by only one source, his family style, and often more specifically his wife. From there, dependence grows, because she is both his only connection and his primary authority. And when one person is both comfort and confinement, escape becomes nearly impossible. Here is the truth: few admit isolation does not make you love more. It only makes you easier to control. Real love never demands that you cut off all other connections as proof of devotion. In fact, those outside relationships are what keep you balanced and whole. When you lose your community, you do not just lose friends, you lose the very ability to recognize yourself. Think about your own life. When was the last time you laughed freely with friends without responsibility weighing on your shoulders? When was the last time you did something purely for your own joy without guilt? If you cannot remember, isolation may already have taken root in you. A man needs love, but he also needs community to keep from losing himself. When community disappears, he is reduced to roles: husband, father, provider. And when only the roles remain, the man within begins to fade. The lesson here is not to reject family, but to understand that true love never asks you to destroy the mirrors that reflect your identity. It allows you to be both a man of family and a man in the larger world. Once you see this clearly, you realize isolation is not a noble sacrifice. It is simply the easiest way for someone else to reshape you, and that is the first step toward disappearing. The drip of criticism that erodes identity. Some wounds are not caused by a single heavy blow, but by thousands of small cuts repeated over time. A man in marriage does not lose his confidence because of one rejection, but because of steady, relentless criticism that seeps into every corner of his mind. These remarks often sound harmless. You should eat healthier. That outfit doesn't look proper. You need to work harder. You're not trying enough. Stop wasting time on those childish hobbies. Taken individually, none of these comments seem dangerous. They can even be justified as care or encouragement. But when they become the rhythm of daily life, they carry an unspoken message: you are never enough. Slowly, the man learns to doubt himself. He hesitates too long over simple decisions. Buying a shirt, picking up a book, meeting a friend. Things that once came naturally now turn into long deliberations about whether they will be judged. Over time, self-doubt eats away at trust in his own judgment, replacing confidence with hesitation, replacing independence with a habit of waiting for approval. This mechanism works so effectively because it does not arrive in the form of brute force. It wears the mask of care. When he reacts, he is told, "I only want the best for you." When he feels hurt, he blames himself for being too sensitive. And so he feels wrong for resisting and guilty for wanting to stand firm. In that emotional maze, the easiest path is silence and compliance. Yet that silence opens the door for identity to erode. Each time he yields, another piece of trust disappears. Each time he dismisses his own desires, another layer of selfhood is stripped away. Until one day, he realizes he has become someone else: reserved, timid, living only for approval instead of living for himself. Identity does not collapse because of one dramatic strike. It fades under countless small stings. like a rock that is not shattered by a hammer but worn smooth by dripping water. By the time it is noticed, the original shape is gone, leaving only a featureless surface. When criticism becomes the environment he lives in, his psychology adapts. He no longer asks, "What do I want instead?" He asks, "Will this be accepted?" Decisions no longer come from within but from the fear of judgment. He lives like a mirror reflecting others' expectations rather than a person with his own clear identity. The tragedy is that this change rarely delivers the outcome intended. A woman may once have been drawn to his confidence and strength, but after years of reshaping and correction, what remains is a diminished version of him, hesitant, withdrawn. And ironically, once he becomes this way, she no longer finds him attractive. The very qualities love once desired are destroyed by the very process meant to improve him. Seen more broadly, this is not just personal but cultural. Men are conditioned to survive by seeking approval, to measure their worth by how well they align with expectations. In doing so, they lose the most precious thing, the inner voice. That voice was meant to be their compass, guiding them toward joy and authenticity. When it is drowned out by external echoes, they lose the ability to live as free beings. A life lived for approval alone may appear peaceful, but in truth it is a gilded cage. The man inside that cage still walks, still smiles, but every step is directed by someone else. And when he finally notices, the path behind him is already sealed, and his identity has been worn down to the point of being unrecognizable. What is necessary is not rejecting all feedback, but learning to discern. Healthy encouragement can sharpen us. Constant rain of criticism, however, will wash away the very ground we stand on. When your confidence begins to vanish, when every decision is haunted by the shadow of judgment, that is the moment to pause and take stock. If you do not, the erosion will continue until nothing remains but the shadow of a self shaped entirely by others' expectations. When personal joy is deemed useless. In the rhythm of married life, something quiet yet profound often happens. Personal joys begin to be treated as luxuries, or worse, as useless indulgences. A man who once had clear passions, whether it was a sport, a musical instrument, or a simple hobby, starts to hear familiar phrases. Does that really help the family? Why waste money on something so pointless? Wouldn't it be better if you spent that time on something else? Each remark on its own may not shake him, but together they plant an idea in his mind. His personal joy is no longer worthy of space. Hobbies once served as oxygen, spaces where he could breathe and reconnect with himself. But when they are labeled unnecessary, he gradually learns to abandon them. Skipping one guitar session, dropping one weekend game, seems harmless at first. Yet over time, those harmless choices accumulate into a life with no room left for him. Hours are filled instead with obligations, family tasks, financial goals, endless responsibility. He becomes busier than ever, but the busyness no longer nourishes his soul. This is the paradox of modern marriage. A man may succeed at work, fulfill every duty, and look like a stable provider, yet inside he feels increasingly hollow. Because a life without personal joy is not truly living, it is merely existing. He may continue to work, to provide, to meet expectations, but nothing makes his heart come alive anymore. And that is the moment when his inner flame begins to die out. The death of a man is not when his heart stops beating. It is when his passion disappears, when his eyes no longer light up at the thought of a hobby, when his hands no longer reach eagerly for something that once brought him happiness. When each day is just a series of duties, then the most vital part of him is already gone. His body remains, but his spirit has quietly left. Many misunderstand personal joy as selfishness. In truth, it is the opposite. A man who keeps his passions alive is the one who radiates energy to those around him. He does not have to sacrifice his own joy to prove love. In fact, by keeping his private space of passion intact, he preserves his identity, and only from that wholeness can he give love in a healthy way. Think carefully, when was the last time you did something purely because it made you happy? Not for work, not for duty, not to please anyone else, simply because it made you feel alive. If the answer does not come easily, perhaps you have been living too long in a rhythm dictated by others. Holding on to passion is not about escaping responsibility. It is about supplying oxygen to the soul. It is the small flame that keeps the house from falling into darkness. A man without personal joy becomes like a machine still running, still functioning, but lifeless. A man who nurtures his own passions, however, becomes like a flowing stream, always fresh, always able to bring life both to himself and to those around him. Do not confuse selfishness with self-nourishment. A father who keeps his hobbies teaches his children that life is not only about duty but also about passion. A husband who protects his individuality makes love more enduring, instead of letting himself fade into the background. And a man who preserves what makes him feel alive will never fully lose himself in social roles. In the end, personal joy is what keeps a man from becoming a mere tool. It proves that he is still alive, still feeling, still longing. When passion is preserved, oxygen still flows to the soul. And when the soul can still breathe, he remains himself. Freedom turned into a privilege that requires permission. There is a subtle transformation in married life, so gradual that most men hardly notice it. It happens when the basic freedoms of an adult man slowly become privileges he must ask for. What was once a natural right now requires negotiation, sometimes even pleading. And when a man accepts this as normal, he has surrendered his equal footing and taken the position of a subordinate. At first, it begins under the name of mutual respect. A man shares a small plan and asks for input. What do you think if I attend this gathering, or I'm planning to play sports this afternoon? How do you feel about that? These questions appear to show care, but as they become more frequent, their meaning shifts. From a gesture of consideration, they evolve into a habit of needing approval. And once this habit forms, it is very difficult to reverse. Gradually, what was once a simple choice turns into a negotiation. Meeting an old friend requires an explanation. Buying something small requires justification. Sleeping in on the weekend requires permission to avoid conflict. An adult man, who once had full authority over his personal decisions, now resembles a child waiting for a parent's signature on a field trip form. When freedom is redefined as a privilege granted, the man is no longer a partner in marriage. He becomes a subordinate, always weighing how not to cross invisible boundaries. In that condition, he no longer lives according to his own choices, but within the frame constructed by someone else. More dangerously, this shift does not only affect behavior, it alters psychology. A man gradually loses confidence in his ability to decide. Every thought that arises is quickly followed by the question, will this be allowed? The inner voice is replaced by an external approval system. And when that becomes routine, he loses the sense of being the author of his own life. A society can measure maturity by how a person uses their freedom. A truly mature man knows how to weigh options, take responsibility, and act wisely. But when a man must ask for permission to live out basic aspects of life, that is not maturity, it is submission. True maturity is the ability to decide and bear the consequences, not the ability to wait for approval. The contrast is clear. On one side stands the man who says, "I will do this and I take responsibility for it." On the other side stands the man who says, "I want to do this, but I need permission." Both may act, but only one is truly living as a free being. The irony is that men often justify this submission themselves. They tell themselves they are being considerate, keeping harmony, being responsible. Yet the more they live by permission, the more they demote themselves to second-class citizens in their own homes. And the longer this continues, the more they forget they once had the right to choose freely. In the end, the harsh truth becomes clear: marriage is no longer companionship, but has turned into a hierarchy. Within that hierarchy, the man has willingly surrendered freedoms that were his by nature. They were not stolen from him, he offered them up, believing it was love. But love cannot be measured by the number of times you ask for permission, and peace cannot be built on submission. A man must remember freedom is never a gift handed down. It is a natural right. Only when he guards his ability to decide does he live as a true adult man, rather than someone begging for pieces of his own life. When intimacy becomes a tool of control. In the early years of marriage, intimacy often carries a natural beauty. A man believes that sex and closeness are the language of love, the space where two people connect and share. But over time, he begins to realize that this closeness is no longer born from pure emotion. It comes with conditions. It becomes a reward only when he does the right things. When intimacy is turned into a tool of control, it loses its essence. Instead of being the natural expression of affection, it becomes a system of rewards and punishments. He is allowed closeness when he works hard, when he follows the rules, when he meets expectations. But if he makes a mistake, if he falls short of the standards imposed, intimacy is withheld. Love no longer feels like a gift freely given. It is used as leverage to remind him that affection now has conditions. This leaves deep psychological scars, invisible but profound. A man starts to believe his value does not come from who he is, but from how well he serves others. He learns that intimacy, once a natural human need, is now granted only when he proves his usefulness. He lives not to love, but to keep up a score in an invisible test. Here lies the painful twist. He thinks he is loved, but in reality, he is only being graded. Every action, every word, every decision becomes part of an evaluation. Intimacy is no longer the gift of connection. It is a prize for compliance. In this system, he is no longer seen as a man with intrinsic worth, but as a tool to be rewarded only when he performs. Conditional love always carries destruction within it. It robs a person of the freedom to be authentic. Instead of simply existing as himself, he must act, adjust, and calculate to avoid losing points. Over time, he forgets what his true self even looks like. The bedroom, which should be a sanctuary of freedom, becomes a stage where he performs a role that never ends. One of the greatest tragedies of this arrangement is the erosion of safety in love. A man no longer feels secure that he is loved unconditionally. He lives with the quiet fear that affection can be withdrawn at any moment if he fails to meet expectations. What was once a bond of trust now feels like an unspoken contract, where intimacy has been reduced to currency. Look deeper, And the truth becomes clear: love does not require conditions to exist. If it requires conditions, it is no longer love, but control. A man does not need to meet a standard to deserve love. He is worthy simply because he is himself, with strengths, weaknesses, flaws, and beauty all included. When intimacy appears only after a test has been passed, it is no longer devotion. It is bargaining. A man must recognize that preserving his identity in love matters more than earning approval. He is not meant to live for a scorecard. He does not need to become a perfect version of himself to be touched by love. True love is not a reward for obedience. It is the space where two people can be entirely themselves and still be cherished. And once he understands this, he finally sees the difference between being loved and being used. A man who is truly loved can be himself, imperfections and all. A man who is used feels he must always do more to avoid losing acceptance. That difference marks the line between a relationship that nurtures and one that destroys. When intimacy is weaponized, a man no longer lives in love. He lives in a never-ending exam. And no one finds freedom in an exam that never ends. Only when he declares himself worthy of love without conditions can he break free from the invisible chains of compliance and rediscover authenticity in his relationships. When identity fades into being merely useful, there comes a point in marriage when a man looks back and realizes that his value is no longer measured by his character or his personal aspirations, but by how well he meets the needs of others. He is no longer asked, "Who are you?" but instead, "What can you do from a human being with a soul, dreams, and his own story?" He becomes a resource, a tool, a useful man. At first, this can feel like pride. Society has long taught men that they must be strong, carry burdens, and serve as pillars. A man feels needed, and he mistakes that for being loved. But here lies the truth: when your worth is reduced only to your ability to serve, you have surrendered the right to exist as an individual. A man who lives solely to fulfill others' needs slowly becomes a shadow of himself. He learns to dismiss his own desires, to treat personal dreams as meaningless, to see passion as a luxury. His life becomes a checklist of tasks where his name appears only as the provider. And after living this way for long enough, his identity begins to dissolve. The cruel irony is this: the very woman who once loved his strength, who was drawn to his confidence and independence, now loses interest in the obedient man he has become. She once longed for his boldness, yet through constant reshaping, she has molded him into someone who only follows. And when that transformation is complete, attraction disappears. This is the bitter paradox of submission. A man believes that doing more, sacrificing more, yielding more will preserve love. But submission never preserves love. It only erodes it. By giving up his independence, he also gives up the magnetism that once made him desirable. A man reduced to being useful may be respected, but rarely is he desired. When identity is gone, the relationship loses its balance. Love thrives only when both individuals remain whole, free, and independent. The moment one dissolves into a tool, the bond shifts from love to dependency. The man may still keep the family structure intact, but he has forfeited his soul in the process. And that loss, sooner or later, destroys the very connection he was trying to protect. Look closer and you will see the deeper tragedy. When you live only to be useful, you strip away the most alive part of yourself. You are no longer a man who brings novelty, surprise, or energy. You become a repetitive machine, producing for others day after day. And nothing is more painful than realizing that your very usefulness has made you invisible in the eyes of the one you serve. A man cannot maintain attraction through obedience. True magnetism does not come from always agreeing, but from having the courage to keep his own identity. A woman may become upset with disagreement, but it is in those moments of friction that she is reminded she is with a real man, not a shadow. Only as an independent being can he remain captivating. Identity is the root of love. When identity fades, love becomes nothing more than obligation. A man may believe unconditional sacrifice is the highest proof of devotion, but in truth, that very sacrifice is what kills the desire that once sustained the bond. Eventually, he faces a vital question. Do you want to live your life as nothing more than a useful man? Or do you want to exist as a full human being with strength, ambition, and uniqueness? The answer will determine not only the state of your marriage, but the value of your entire life. The price of change. When a man begins to realize he has lost his identity, the natural question arises, does he have the courage to change? Yet the moment this thought surfaces, a wall of obstacles appears, making escape feel impossible. These barriers are not only external, they are also deeply rooted within his own mind. The first barrier is financial. After years of building a life together, joint assets, mortgages, and constant expenses become chains that bind him. He realizes that any decision to leave comes with a heavy price, dividing assets, taking on debts, even losing the house he spent his life working for. Finances are not just numbers on a page, they are visible shackles that turn every intention to change into painful arithmetic. Next comes the social barrier. Marriage does not exist in isolation. It is held up by family, friends, colleagues, and community. When a man considers change, he faces judgmental eyes, sharp words, and even rejection. He is told he is irresponsible, selfish, ungrateful. And to avoid being condemned by society, many men choose to stay even when their hearts have already fractured. But the heaviest barrier is psychological. After years of living in submission, a man begins to believe he no longer has the strength to stand alone. He fears loneliness, fears stepping into a world without the familiar hand that, though it shackles him, also comforts him. Learned helplessness whispers that nothing will change, that leaving will only bring more suffering. And so he convinces himself that enduring the present is safer than daring to step into the unknown. All these barriers combine to form a fortress wall, keeping him inside. The longer the chains have been worn, the harder they are to break. Yet here lies the cruel truth: staying is also a form of death. Each day spent in submission erodes a little more of the self. Each year of silence withers the soul further. The man does not die all at once, but piece by piece, until all that remains is a busy shell of existence. What must be faced is this: change always has a price. Leaving a marriage, reshaping a life, enduring judgment, these are real wounds. But sometimes short-term pain is the necessary price to avoid long-term destruction. A surgery is painful, but it saves the body from the disease that would have killed it slowly. In the same way, change may shatter a season of life, but it opens the door to a life that can be truly lived. A man must ask himself, will you choose the pain of a short wound, or the slow death of a hollow life? A fracture can collapse everything in an instant, but from the rubble, something real can be rebuilt. Staying may seem safer, quieter, less disruptive, but it is simply agreeing to die a little more each day. Change is never free. It always demands a price, sometimes a steep one. But the real question is not whether you are willing to pay for change. The The real question is whether you are brave enough to see the price of not changing. For remaining in submission is also paying only at a higher cost the erosion of identity, the suffocation of the soul, the disappearance of yourself. Only when a man understands that short-term pain is the only path to escape slow death does he find the courage to break through the wall of chains. Because in the end, change is not just about leaving something behind. It is about choosing once again to be the author of your own life. The invisible legacy left to the next generation. A man often believes that all his sacrifices are for his children. He works tirelessly. He yields. He endures the loss of his own self with the conviction that it will secure a better future for them. But here is a truth few are willing to confront. What you leave your children is not just money, not just tuition, not just a house. The most important thing you leave behind is the model of what it means to be a man. And that model silently becomes the mold shaping your son's life. A boy does not need anyone to lecture him on masculinity. He observes, he watches his father and learns. When he sees a man constantly yielding, staying silent, submitting, he understands that being a man means enduring. When he sees his father reduced to being useful, he concludes that a man's value lies in obedience. And when he sees his father no longer living for himself, he learns that personal dreams must be buried to earn a place in the family. These lessons are not written in books, and no one says them out loud, but they sink in deeper than anything else. A boy raised in such an atmosphere will enter life already shaped, destined to become another version of blind sacrifice. And the tragedy is this: the father thinks he is giving his son a better life, but in reality he is passing down an invisible cage, binding him to the very path where he himself is trapped. Blind sacrifice is not a gift. It is the most dangerous inheritance, because it does not just suffocate one generation, it plants seeds for the next to repeat the same cycle. A father may leave his child a house, but if he himself lives in submission, that house is nothing more than a different kind of prison. The painful twist is this: you think you are living for your children, but in truth, you are teaching them how to destroy themselves. Every time you stay silent, your son learns to suppress. Every time you submit, he learns to give up on himself. Every time you abandon your passions, he learns that personal joy does not matter. What you pass down is not love that liberates, but a roadmap to self-erasure. This is why a man's responsibility is not only to provide. His greater responsibility is to be a living example of humanity. A boy does not need a perfect father. He needs a father who dares to live as a real man, who protects his identity, preserves his freedom, nurtures his passions and ambitions. From that, the boy learns that life is not just about duty, but about vitality, truth, and courage. The way you live today is your child's tomorrow. If you live in submission, your son will learn to live that way too. If you live as a free man, your son will draw strength to become himself. This is not just the story of one life, it is the story of generations. And you are the link that decides whether the cycle continues or ends. A true legacy is not measured in wealth, it is measured in the example you set. And the crucial question for every man is this: do you want your son to grow up to be a strong, free man, or a well-behaved donkey trained to obey? The answer lies in the life you are living today, the path back to yourself. The moment of awakening often arrives suddenly, and it is rarely gentle. It happens when a man looks into the mirror and no longer recognizes the face staring back. The eyes are the same, the features are the same, but the fire is gone. What remains is weariness, a shadow of the man he once was. And the question arises, who have I become? And when did it happen? That question marks the beginning of awakening. Because only when he admits his identity has been eroded can he take the first step back to himself. The truth he must remember is this: before he was a husband, a father, or a provider, he was a human being, a man with intrinsic worth, who does not need to prove usefulness or seek constant approval to deserve love and respect. Through years of submission, many men believe their freedom has been stolen. But the truth is, freedom was never lost. It has only been asleep within them. Each silence, each abandoned passion, each compromise for approval has lulled freedom deeper into slumber. Yet it remains, waiting to be awakened. And when courage finally stirs, he discovers it was always there. The path back does not require grand gestures. It begins with small but vital steps. The first step is relearning how to say no. That single word may disappoint others, but it is a powerful declaration that you still exist as an individual. It is a reminder that you still have the right to choose, to refuse, to claim part of your life for yourself. The next step is reconnecting with community. Reach out to old friends, join a group, return to an activity that once lit you up. Every connection acts as a mirror, reflecting back pieces of yourself you thought were lost. Community reminds you that you are more than a role within a family. You are a person with many sides, each worthy of expression. Then nurture your personal joy again. Pick up the guitar, open the book, run the familiar trail. These are not trivial hobbies. They are oxygen for the soul. They keep you alive, not just existing. A man with passion is a man whose spirit still breathes. This journey will not be easy. It demands courage to face judgment, to endure initial conflict, to walk through the fear of abandonment. But it is the price of true life. And once you taste freedom again, you will understand no chain is worth remaining in a cage. Remember this: you do not need perfection to be loved. You do not need submission to be accepted. You are worthy simply because you exist, as you are. And once you reclaim your true identity, you not only save yourself, you offer your children a living example of courage and freedom. If these reflections have helped you recognize something within yourself, stay with this journey. There are many more truths ahead, waiting to be uncovered. And if you miss them, you may continue living inside a cage without even knowing it.